There we go. Wait for people to jump in. Great to see. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third and final webinar in Pony Club Australia's series From Gut Health to Good Welfare. I'm Emma Legrand, Marketing and Communications Manager at Pony Club Australia. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. And tonight's session is entitled When Behaviour Changes, Looking at the Whole Horse. And we're super lucky to have Dr. Ben Sykes back with us again session. For anyone joining us for the first time, Ben is one of the world's leading voices in equine gastric ulcer syndrome, or EGUS. He's an equine veterinarian with more than 27 years of clinical experience. He's a world-renowned expert in gastric health and veterinary internal medicine and is board certified in large animal internal medicine by the American College of Veterinary Internal Medicine. And across the first two webinars, Ben has helped us really think about gastric ulcers, forage, routine management, and welfare as connected parts of the bigger picture. We started with ulcers as a welfare window and then looked at forage, routine, and the modern horse. And tonight we're bringing that conversation through to behaviour, which is such an important topic because when a horse's behavior changes, it can be really easy to jump to a conclusion. We might think, is the horse being naughty or lazy or stubborn or difficult? Or at the other end of the spectrum, we might think, oh, it must be ulcers. But one of the big messages from this series has been that behavior is communication, and it can be a really important clue that something is going on, but it's not a diagnosis on its own. So tonight we'll talk about where ulcers fit into that picture, why they absolutely can be part of the story, and why they're not always the whole story, and why it's so important to look at the whole horse. So just before we start, a quick reminder that tonight's session is general education only. It's not a replacement for veterinary advice, diagnosis, or treatment for an individual horse. So if you have any concerns about your own horse or pony, please speak with your vet. We will have time for questions towards the end, so you can pop those in the chat box as we go, and we'll get through as many as we can. So Ben, thank you so much for being back with us. It's been a really great series so far, and I'm really looking forward to tonight's conversation.
Pleasure to be back again. And yeah, this is almost probably my favorite element of the whole thing. My grassroots are gastric ulcers, but I think this behavioral piece is such a critical element that's really burst onto the scene in the last couple of years.
Yes, absolutely. So before we get started in earnest, can you just recap what you mean when you describe ulcers as a welfare window?
Yeah, so obviously, our goal is good welfare for our horses. I think the really critical thing is, and this is what I think a lot of the modern conversations or the current conversations shift in, it's not our perception of what's good welfare that matters. It's the horse's perception of what good welfare matters. So, we see arguments, well, the horse has a stall, it has bedding, it has food, it has water, it gets veterinary care, it has good welfare. I would actually, they're just the minimum requirements for owning an animal. That doesn't necessarily mean that that animal perceives its environment as good welfare. It doesn't mean it doesn't, but it doesn't mean that it does. And so what we see more and more is a recognition that ulcers, but measuring welfare is hard. Measuring that horse's perception of welfare is hard. But we know that ulcers are caused by things that are equivalent to impositions on welfare. So we know that inadequate forage is an imposition on welfare that also causes issues with causing gastric disease as a driver of gastric disease. We know that eating behavior is a really subtle reflection of a horse's welfare state. A horse has to feel safe and secure to eat. Decreased eating behavior is going to increase our risk of ulcers. And we know that glandular disease, which is very much a stress-based disease, is also that individual horses experience. So we've always sort of said, well, ulcers are important because they're a disease that causes pain to the animal and there's a welfare implication. But we're also starting to look at it from the other end and say, well, when we see the ulcers, what is that telling us about that individual horse's relationship with its own environment rather than some of the big generalizations we make, like lots of hay, not many carbohydrates, and everything will be okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you also just remind us of the difference between squamous and glandular gastric disease and why that distinction matters when we start talking about behavior?
Yeah, the distinction starts being particularly important when we talk about behavior because we have two separate diseases in the horse's stomach. I think of them as the odd couple. They happen to live in the same apartment, but they're completely unrelated to each other and they're very, very different. Top half of the stomach, squamous mucosa, like our skin, like our esophagus. And really, what we see there is an acid injury, excessive acid exposure to the squamous mucosa causes a chemical burn. And that's manifested. It's very similar to heartburn in people and gastroesophageal reflux disease, but really think of it as heartburn in people. The bottom half of the stomach's much more complex. It's designed to be bathed in acid. The mechanisms that the normal protective mechanisms break down for reasons we don't understand, but we see that stress is a driver of that or perpetuator of that. And we see different manifestations there of presentation. So we tend to see when we talk about behavior, we have to recognize behavior is an enormously broad term when we talk about the clinical signs associated with behavior for different diseases. Squamous, we will see pain-based behavior, but we also tend to see things like changes in eating behavior. Again, if you think of the heartburn analogy, if you have heartburn, you don't want to eat normally. And so we see changes in hay consumption, particularly. The glandular disease, a little bit more like peptic ulcer disease or ulcers in people, we tend to see more true pain-based type behavior and reactive type behavior and even anticipatory type pain behavior as well.
Yeah, sure. And we're just going to go back and do a little bit of myth busting. You've explained before that some horses with ulcers can look absolutely fantastic from the outside.
Yeah, I mean, so as I said, squamous disease, there is an association between squamous disease and unexplained weight loss, rough hair coat, and loss of appetite. But glandular disease, there is no such relationship. And the poster child for glandular disease is the warm blood dressage horse that looks absolutely immaculate on the outside, but is internalizing that stress and that's been manifested by glandular disease on the inside. So absolutely, we cannot look at the horse from the outside and say, and it works both ways. We cannot look at the horse from the outside and say it has this behavior, therefore it's ulcers, or it doesn't have this behavior, therefore it's not ulcers, or it doesn't have this clinical sign. There's some generalizations we apply, but at an individual level, those generalizations are so weak that they fall apart very, very quickly.
Yeah. So on behavior and EGUS, like when someone says to you, my horse is girthy or reluctant, resistant, or not just quite right, could it be ulcers? How would you normally answer that?
Yeah, so we stand on the shoulders of giants, and the giant in this field has been Sue Dyson. Sue Dyson's ridden horse pain ethogram that came out sort of on the tail end of COVID really changed the way we think of it. And so the ridden horse pain ethogram is basically 24 behaviors that are the horse's language of pain during ridden behavior. There'll be things like tail swishing, there'll be things like changing, breaking stride, gait changes. A lot of it's around head position, sideways from the vertical or in front of the bit, behind the bit, mouth open. There's a whole range of them that do that. So, we recognize now that they're the horse's language of pain. But that group's also looked at horses with musculoskeletal disease and looked at their behavior during tacking up. So looking at horses during tacking up and mounting, and they showed that horses with orthopedic disease, i.e. lameness, so a sore hock or back leg or sore front feet or coffin joints, had increased undesirable behavior during tacking up and mounting as well. So girthing's the classic one. So girthing, we say, oh, my horse is girthy, it must have ulcers. No, um, there's really very little correlation. They could have ulcers, or that can just be a uh, non-specific pain-based behavior because the horses are capable of forming this association. They know that when you put the saddle on, that the next thing you're going to do is ride them, and that riding is going to cause discomfort, regardless of where that pain comes from, whether it's dental, legs, back, or gastric. And you'll even see some horses, if you watch them really closely, you don't even need to put the saddle on them. You just walk past them with the saddle and they change their expression and show, this is coming. I don't like this. So, yeah, girthiness is the classic one. Oh, it's girthy. It must have ulcers. But no, girthiness is a manifestation of the horse's communication of anticipatory pain, not of a specific cause of pain.
So is there any one thing or combination of factors where you might say, yes, ulcers is high on the list of things we should investigate?
When we're talking about those behaviors, so when we're talking about behavior during tacking up, during mounting, and during riding, no. That will be the shortest answer you'll get from me.
Yep.
There is no specific behavior that you can point out and says, my horse does this, it must have ulcers. The problem is, or one of the challenges is, you see those behaviors and then you go and perform gastroscopy on horses. And because we know 50 to 70% of our performance horses have some degree of ulceration, you see the behavior, you perform the gastroscopy, it's got ulcers, therefore the ulcers must be causing the behavior. But correlation does not equal causation. The critical element there is does the behavior stop when you treat the ulcers? And very, very often people will say, I've had a horse, it had ulcers, I treated its ulcers, the stomach looks better, but the horse is still behaving undesirably. Why? And I think, other causes of pain or learnt behavior are the things that we really need to broaden that conversation into.
Yeah, sure. So, now that we understand the difference between squamous and glandular disease, you might see symptoms regarding behavior or appetite or performance, but essentially the only way you can reliably know is by scoping.
The only way you can reliably know is by scoping. We will have cases where we can't scope and we will do trial treatments. And that's not an unreasonable thing to do. It's not, scoping's not always as readily available as we'd like it to be. I'd like there to be a lot more gastroscopes available in Australia. We're kind of behind. New Zealand is even ahead of us there in terms of availability of gastroscopy. But it's recognizing that what we're seeing is a behavior. And so, for example, if we can't gastroscope and we do a test treatment, we should see a change. And it should be a clear and obvious change. And if it's not, then it really tells us we need to have an accurate diagnosis before we continue down the path of just treating because we think it's something. And then the other thing about the diagnostic point of it is it doesn't necessarily just have to be one thing. It's actually very common that we'll see horses with gastric disease and lameness or musculoskeletal disease and sore backs, and they all potentially drive each other. The lameness and sore back potentially drives gastric disease. And so we can't just run the horse to a gastroscopy clinic, scope it, say it's got ulcers, and not look at the rest of the horse. We have to look at the whole horse, both as a cause of the undesirable behavior, but also as a potential driver of why the ulcers might be there in the first place. So ulcers are important, but they're only a small part of a much larger animal, and we have to look at the whole animal. Versus the old days where we would just run them through gastroscopy clinics, make a diagnosis and treat them. That's really not the standard of care that we're pushing towards these days.
And can there be any other causes of discomfort elsewhere in the digestive system that will affect how a horse behaves?
Yeah, so this is where it gets it's a good question. It's a difficult question to answer with sort of a level of high scientific confidence. We definitely see small intestinal disease. We definitely see hindgut disease. The term hindgut ulcers was invented by a supplement company who had, what do you know, the solution to hindgut ulcers. That's not to say that horses don't get hindgut disease. Hindgut disease does occur, but what we have to be careful is that the term, and they're not ulcers. I always say the term hindgut disease, not hindgut ulcers, because they're not ulcers. They're not like the ulcers that we see in the stomach where you look at them and there's a crater in the horse's stomach or the horse's hindgut. That's not what happens in the hindgut. They become a sort of a bit of a cop-out very often. They become a cop-out to say, oh, well, if it's not foregut ulcers, it must be hindgut ulcers. We can't prove it's there, but guess what? We've got a supplement that will fix that for you. Again, if we're doing that, we would want to see a very, very clear response to our intervention. What concerns me there is that we're actually potentially missing far more important things. So we're missing in a lot of our pony club horses, in a lot of our competition horses, A lot of these horses do have wear and tear on their limbs. A lot of them are ex-race horses that have had athletic careers before they came to Pony Club or before they come to my family for 3-day eventing. They've got wear and tear on their limbs that builds up over time. That orthopedic element is so important to those horses that we shouldn't just be jumping to the hindgut as a cop out just because it's not the stomach.
Yeah.
It's not to say
Yeah.
hindgut disease is not important, does not to say it doesn't happen, but it's way overemphasized in the big picture. And I think we're doing our horses a disservice if that's what we jump straight to.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah. Um, so with our pony club families and recognizing change, and hopefully we're recognizing it early. But pony club families, they often know their horses extremely well. Like from a veterinary perspective, how valuable is that day-to-day knowledge when something does start to change?
It's absolutely essential. It's the change in behavior in trained horses. I think one of the things this you can get into some straw man arguments very quickly where it's very easy to sort of drag out to an extreme and have a discussion around this, but we've really stopped trying to use the words bad behavior. Now, I do believe that there are some horses that are just wired that way. The 3-day-old foal that tries to rip you apart when you walk into the stable probably is bad to the bone. Now, that's just that foal's personality and that foal's character. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to hell. But I think that's that point about understanding what's normal for that horse and also the impact of training and appropriate training. So, a lot of the things in the ridden horse pain ethogram, like I said, a lot of them are about head position and stuff like that. Well, as a horse is learning, all those things are normal. So we can't automatically assume that those changes are associated with pain or that those behaviors are associated with pain. But when we move into our well-educated horses that have been doing their job for us and we know that they're willing, kind, and honest and want to work, and they suddenly stop being that horse, then that is by far the most important trigger to say there's a problem here, and that problem most likely, and until it is excluded, is pain based. And it can be really hard because it can be quite subtle. It can be a lot of our competition horses can have subtle bilateral disease, so they don't look obviously lame, but it doesn't mean that they're not in discomfort or pain and reacting to stuff. It might be a horse that's been a little bit uneven for a long time, but able to manage that behaviorally. But now something else is on top of that. It's crossed a threshold and saying, I don't want to do this anymore. I've had enough. So yes, I told you got one short answer. That's a long answer to say that understanding of this is not, my horse is not behaving the way that he always does is the trigger to say we need to find out why. And our endpoint should be that that behavior ultimately stops and that the horse
Mm.
goes back to being willing to where it was. And the vast majority of the time when you find the problem, that's exactly what happens. It's just sometimes finding that problem can be really challenging as you work through it.
Yeah. Have you got any other things in mind when you think about changes that parents, riders, coaches might observe that would prompt them to stop and ask, something's going on here?
Yeah, I think, we see things like, resistance, I think is probably the one I think, and, laziness. Oh, the horse is suddenly lazy. The horse is smart enough to go, if I do that, it's going to hurt. I don't want to. And that's seen as disobedience or laziness. Um, I think they're the big ones. Horses that suddenly start becoming at the other end of the spectrum that become more reactive, that they've always been quite happy doing something and now they've become more difficult to handle. So there are some subtle behaviors. I think tail swishing is one of the ones to really that's easy to see. And when you see a horse that's riding just swishing its tail, swishing its tail, swishing its tail, that's a manifestation of not necessarily pain, because none of these markers are specific pain, but that's frustration or pain. And sometimes that frustration's there as the horse is trying to learn a new skill. But we don't expect to see that frustration in a well-trained horse doing its job every day. So I think they're the big ones. Ears pinned back. Some horses do it. But horse that hasn't historically done that, that now sort of goes out, has its ears pinned back and doesn't want to, um, would stand out. Another one would be the horse that's always been good at getting on the trailer and all of a sudden just doesn't want to get on the trailer, doesn't want to go and do those things that you want to go and do with it. There are a lot of reasons why that might happen, but that horse is communicating and trying to tell you something. It's then a matter of trying to work through what that is.
Yeah, sure. And um, just to you did talk about this briefly before, but I suppose just to reiterate that when we talk about behavior change being the horse's language of communication, um, when pain or when discomfort shows up, it's not necessarily related to where where they're feeling the pain.
Yeah, exactly. It's non-specific. So they don't have the horses are fantastic communicators to a certain level. They're fantastic communicators in regards to their ability to communicate pain. They're not, we just haven't been historically great listeners to that. Um, but there is a threshold to what they can communicate, which is they can't then say, but the pain's coming from my stomach, but the pain's coming from my leg. Now, obviously, lameness is the most obvious manifestation of pain in a limb, and that is a localizing sign. Change in appetite is going to point us to the stomach, but most of these behaviors are not specific. They're just very, very generalized.
Yeah, sure. And with anticipatory behavior, if that original discomfort improves, can some horses retain a learned or anticipatory response for like a while or quite a while?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we see that particularly in that ground-based behavior. So what we tend to see is the ridden behavior tends to be more dynamic and more reactive. There'll be particular things that pop up, like the horse might have developed a particular reason why it doesn't want to go to that corner of the arena, but generally its overall behavior will improve. And again, Sue Dyson's done this work with lameness where they show these horses showing this behavior and they remove that with local anesthetic and diagnostic analgesia, and the horses stop the behavior straight away when they feel better. The ground-based behavior, I think, is more challenging because it is more of a learnt anticipatory response, and it is behavior that we do need to often address proactively alongside making sure we're addressing the primary cause of pain. So when I said something needs to change when we implement a treatment or an intervention, it won't necessarily mean we get 100% resolution. It might mean we get a partial resolution, in which case we need to consider, is there more than one problem or is some of this a learnt behavior? The good thing is the things that we do to manage the initial frontline treatment for anticipatory behavior are all the same things we do for gastric ulcers. We change that horse's relationship with the activity we're forming. So we bring them up, we spend more time grooming them, we look at massaging, these types of things. We give them pre-exercise food. So now they've got a positive association formed with being caught and put into the cross ties or the tack up box, rather than a negative association being formed, which is, oh, I'm getting caught. That means I'm going to get ridden. That means it's going to hurt. So it's trying to break those behavioral associations they form and also to build resilience and tolerance into their behavioral patterns.
Mm. And can we talk a bit about where saddle fit sits in the whole picture, especially when we're thinking about pain, behavior, and ridden work?
Saddle fit fits absolutely in the center of it, of all of it. I think that poor saddle fit or inappropriate saddle fit, so we could say poor, but it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with that saddle. It just means that saddle and that horse aren't compatible. But I think that poor saddle fit's probably one of the things that's by far the most common driver of undesirable behavior during riding that then potentially leads into that potentially then leads into anticipatory behavior as well. So it's definitely one of the things, when I say lameness or musculoskeletal disease, that includes absolutely palpating the back. And if there's any concerns, then assessing saddle fit. And it's by far one of the most central things. And we know that horses with back pain or leg pain are less likely to respond to pharmacological treatment for glandular disease. So it's not just a disease in its own right, it's a driver also of gastric disease. So there's this inherent intersection between those. I just want to answer the question on the chat there. Someone said, when they recognize a change in behavior, whether to call the vet or the body worker. If you see that change in behavior and it's consistent and you recognize that as an owner who is familiar with their horse, that's the time to do it. It doesn't mean it's going to be an easy fix to find the problem, but that's the time to start asking that question, because their horses don't magically change their behavior for no reason. There's always a reason why their behavior changes. It might not be an easy reason to find, it might not be a simple reason, or it might be a simple reason. But that's the time to start asking that question before you get stuck into this loop that we're just talking about here. The longer it goes on, the more time they have to build up that anticipatory behavior, the harder it is to change, the more
Yeah.
ingrained it becomes.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying is that pain, stress, and behavioral changes and ulcers, they can all fuel each other over
Yeah, they all
time.
tie into each other. And
Yeah.
if we think about that, I was always taught not to think anthropomorphically, but it is. If we have, a lot of us as we get older, we might have, I've got a hip that's always a little bit sore, but I've kind of managed that and I can get by every day and it's fine. But now all of a sudden I hurt my knee on the other side, and the knee's not that sore, but together I've crossed my threshold of being able to deal with things. And, I think when we think about these older horses, when we think about competition horses that are performing particularly at higher levels, it, it's it's logical that they have multiple body systems that are potentially under pressure, either due to the effects of aging or due to the effects of performance and the demands of their sports.
Mm. Um, so I was going to ask about in terms of breaking that cycle, but we might circle back to
Yeah,
that.
sure.
Yeah. So if in the circumstance where ulcers are found on a gastroscopy, what should happen next? And how do we avoid assuming that the ulcers were the whole answer? And this really feeds into the breaking the cycle, I think.
I would say never assume that the ulcers are the whole answer, um, from two angles. One is that, again, we know our horses often have complex issues, so we shouldn't just be looking at these horses' stomachs. We should be looking at the whole horse. We should be doing basic lameness examinations. We should be palpating the back. Anytime we scope a stomach, we should be looking at those other things alongside that dental disease as well. So I don't think we should ever just assume that the ulcers are the whole problem. Um, because we know that those ulcers, they don't just magically appear. They're an outcome of other things that are impacting on that horse. So they might be an outcome of concurrent pain, like back pain or musculoskeletal pain, or they might be an outcome of behavioral impositions on that horse's life, environmental impositions on that horse's life. So ulcers can be very central to what's going on, but it is more than that. We always need to be looking for what caused them and what might be running in parallel with them.
Um, so back in webinar two, when we talked about forage, routine, and predictability, how can those management factors show up in behavior?
Yeah, so I mean, as a general rule, horses are creatures of habit. They like their habit. I think they like their routine. It varies depending on those housing environments of the horses. So the horses that are out in the field, they have a lot more choice. They have a lot more variability in their lives. That's a positive thing for them. When we see horses that are stabled more often, then that reliability of things like feed times and that starts becoming much more important, because in some ways that's a much more central element to that horse's life. So making sure that we have predictability in those is sort of a core principle of providing an optimal environment for that horse from a welfare perspective. And then the implications of that welfare enhancement or lack of adequate welfare then flows into gastric disease, rather than thinking of them as necessarily directly causing gastric disease. except when we have cases like we've got hay restriction and stuff like that, that can be both driving welfare issues and driving gastric disease issues simultaneously.
Yeah, sure. And you said earlier that horses need to feel safe and secure to eat. But if their hay intake changes, I suppose one, as you've pointed out before, you really need to be across how much they're consuming in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, knowing having an idea of how much does your horse normally eat seems like such a simple thing, but it's actually really hard. I mean, we have horses that live in the field in 6 horses with a big round bale of hay. One horse changing is very, very hard to measure. We have other horses that live in pairs, and if we see a change in hay consumption, we ask the question why. Maybe it's because spring's come in, the grass is kicked, and they're just less interested, or maybe there's something else going on. But knowing that roughage consumption, monitoring that roughage consumption, more so in horses in stable environments where they are fed individually, knowing that and monitoring that's really important. And that roughage consumption, that hay consumption, is a reflection of that horse's environment and how that horse is adapting to its environment. So we know that horses outside spend about 50% more time eating than horses inside on average. We know that horses with companionship spend about 40% time more eating than horses living in isolation on average. So when we have horses that aren't living outside, that aren't living with companions, it really emphasizes to us that monitoring that roughage intake is a very, very central element of understanding how those conditions are affecting that individual horse's welfare and that individual horse's risk of gastric disease.
Yeah. And how does sleep fit into the picture? Could a horse that's not resting properly look like a training or behavior problem?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know sleep deprivation's we know that if we're tired, we don't learn. We know from numerous studies, if you look at airline industry, if you look at the medical industry, if you've been awake more than 16 hours, you're effectively legally drunk type thing. These types of things, and that's not even sleep deprivation, that's just tiredness. And then when you get to sleep deprivation, the impact of sleep deprivation on learning is huge. It is very hard to learn when you're sleep deprived, and horses are the same. So there is a growing body of evidence that really supports that extrapolation from what we experience as humans with sleep deprivation and the impacts of our ability to learn applies to horses, and the timelines are very, very similar. So, one night without sleep has a big impact on a horse's ability to learn, and its ability to emotionally regulate and these types of things. So we need to be careful of drawing direct parallels between our experiences and their experiences, but the general direction of those parallels is very, very consistent.
Mm. And how can travel and competition and stabling away from home or separation from companions affect behavior and gastric health?
Yeah, I mean that's it's such a huge question. So if we start at the back end of that, gastric health, again, we want to think about things like it really comes down to making sure we have adequate roughage consumption during our away periods. It's important to recognize that gastric ulcers don't appear on a Sunday morning gymkhana. We might see them there. The horse might be showing the clinical signs because it's out and about and its threshold is lowered, but they don't occur between getting on the horse float at 6 o'clock in the morning and arriving at the gymkhana at 9 o'clock, depending on how far away you live from your local pony club. When we go away for a weekend, they don't tend to occur just in one weekend. They are diseases of wear and tear and they build up over time. But we can certainly see them within, 5 days of competition. We can start to see, really, really relevant gastric disease. So that really comes down to then that aspect of managing the horse at the center of it and making sure our horses are adapted and trained to that. And some horses travel better than other horses. And we probably don't pay enough attention to those horses that are struggling, that actually we maybe need to think about how we can build those adaptations into that horse so it's a more normalized behavior to engage like that than it is than a shock to the system. And then we've got these other horses that travel and don't give a hoot. They get on the trailer, they get off the trailer, they eat their dinner, they have a sleep. You turn your back on them, it's 10 o'clock at night, they're laying down, they're having their sleep. Um, but I think we need to recognize those impacts, and then we need to recognize whether we actually need to spend more time focusing on adaptation for those horses rather than dropping them in the deep end.
Mm,
Uh, I will say that's one of the things that, in general, the off the track thoroughbreds do well is that type of stuff because they have been conditioned to it. Their lives have been spent traveling, their lives have been spent changing social groups, their lives have been spent moving into different environments. And it's not for every thoroughbred, racing thoroughbred. They don't all do well in that environment, but it's definitely one of the advantages we see with off the track thoroughbreds is sometimes that ability to transition to what we want them to do is a lot easier because they've got a lot of experience doing it. They've had a lot of conditioning to the world won't end just because they've changed locations type mentality.
mm. Um, a few weeks back, we did a Welfare Wednesday post, and the gist of it basically was if you're going to a competition and stables are on offer, if you don't normally stable your horse,
Don't do it. If you're gonna, yeah. And we have, I won't name the place because it's a fantastic facility that does an amazing job, but you have to go there and you have to put your horse in stables. And then just occasionally they'll open up and say, well, we're full, the stables are full. Does anyone want to slum it down the back with your own yards? And we're like, bang, we're there. Because the horses are so much happier because that's how our horses normally travel, and our horses normally they've got more space, they're happy in that environment, they're much more comfortable with that because our personal horses never stable at home. We've got stables for feeding, but they're never stabled at night because that's the environment we have them in. So yeah, trying to keep that in their system as much as possible. We recognize when we go to say SIAC, which we'll go to 2 weekends away from now, those stables are solid walls and very challenging for some horses. Some horses really don't do well in that environment. And we're very conscious to make sure our horses can see each other and see their friends and their peers. We can't make sure they can touch each other, but we make sure they can see their friends and peers so um, they feel safer and more comfortable. And okay, we've got more than one horse. We've got 3 or 4 horses we travel with. It's easier to do, but it's something that we recognize as important. Um, it sounds really soft to say find them a travel buddy, but they have friends, and those friends are emotionally important to them. So maybe you have one horse, but then you've got another friend who also competes in the same sort of circuit, and you travel together. You might not want to camp on top of each other, but let your horses, if they're friends, let your horses camp together. Those types of things,
mm,
because that emotional security is probably way understated for them.
yeah. Um, so I'm just keeping an eye on the questions, but we'll circle around to these. We're going to sort of talk about the hot topic of supplements. Across the series, we've talked about treatment and management and prevention. Where do you think supplements fit into that picture?
Yeah, so supplements can be a really important bridge. They can be a really important, valuable tool for us to work with horses that have had ulcers, have been treated. Supplements are not a treatment and they should never be positioned as a treatment. And when you see them being positioned as if your horse has ulcers and given this supplement, it'll be magically cured, I think you need to be very, very skeptical of that messaging. What their best place to do is to say the treatment does the job of treatment. Where does the supplement come in? Well, the supplement can be useful for creating a bridge to those long-term management transition changes because sometimes those changes take time to make. They can be a useful bridge when we can't make all of those changes. We recognize one of the reasons we talk about all these risk factors is the ideal reason to talk about risk factors is to identify them and change them. The second objective of talking about risk factors is to identify them and see if we can accommodate them. There are things that we can't always change in horses' environments, in modern horse management, but maybe we can find a way around a bridge to be in between. So supplements can do that. Supplements can also be very useful in some of our horses with chronic disease that don't respond completely to medications, and particularly our glandular disease. It's not uncommon to see horses that have glandular disease that typically will improve with treatment but not heal, and we've got a chronic disease we need to manage there. So they can be really, really valuable, but there's some big caveats to them as well.
Sure. And so if ulcers are present, would is veterinary medication always required before you're going to use a supplement, or does it depend on the horse and the situation?
I think it depends. It depends on the horse and the situation. It depends on what else is going to change. If your expectation is my horse has ulcers, nothing else is going to change, and I'm going to give a supplement because it will cure the ulcers the same way the medication does, that is a fallacy. That is just simply not what a supplement is intended to do, designed to do, or capable of doing. That goes back to the idea of that bridge. If we've got an animal, and we talked about this in one of our earlier webinars, I think it was the last one, where we say, is treatment always essential? And the answer is no. There are circumstances where we can manage ulcers back out for the same reasons were caused in the first place. There are circumstances that are individualized that we can manage those horses back where the ulcers will self-heal if we can um, optimize the environment or optimize the management. And again, supplements can provide a bridge to that, but absolutely not. We cannot put them up against the medications and say, well, nothing else is going to change. We're just going to rely on this. They can't do that. It's more about, as I said, thinking of them as a bridge, thinking of them as a transition, or thinking of them when we're fixed as much as we can and we still have a concern, then there can be a place for them as a sort of a secondary measure.
So in terms of helping people, think critically in their evaluation of products they might be looking at, we were talking about it before we jumped on. If this is not your field, it's hard to come in and to know
Yeah.
where to start, what to ask, what to look for. So
Yeah, so it is. It's really hard to critique this. If I mean, it's easy. I have a scientific background. This is what I do all day. But it can be really hard without that background. And it would be no different if I went into a class on quilting and suddenly got told, I had to start learning quilting. I don't. It's a different language. I don't know what you're talking about. Um, so I think the first thing is, if it's too good to be true, it's too. If it sounds too good to be true, it sounds too good to be true. If the supplement is promising to cure your ulcers, it's too good to be true. You're now talking to a company that's not reputable. Done. And it's the pub test. If they're not reputable, don't deal with them. It would be the same as if it cures everything. The supplement that cures everything, the supplement that'll fix their coat, fix their feet, fix their gut, fix their eye color, make them behave better. Too good to be true. Discount it. Then I think get into a more critical phase. And really the benchmark is, has research been performed on this supplement? And has that research been published in the independent peer-reviewed literature? So it's not uncommon to see supplement companies say, well, we performed some research. And you say, okay, where's the data? Oh, that's our data. We don't tell anyone. It's like, well, if it was good data, surely you would tell everyone. At the very least, the data should be present. And then that publication in an international peer-reviewed journal is really the benchmark, because that's that external validation of the research that says this work has been done, and the claims that these people are making in this claims that these scientists are making in this publication are reflected by the data that they've made those claims based on. The data says what they're saying is backed by the data. And so it's really, has the research been formed? Where's the data? Show it to me. And has it been published? Where's the publication? And those three questions very, very, very quickly filter out the magical, mythical fairy dust story from the ones that really have scientific validity behind them.
yeah, no, thank you for that. That's very helpful in letting people know where to start, because it is a minefield out there, and it can become a very expensive one too if for not much return if you don't know how to do your research.
Yeah, and look, it's the wild. The other thing for people to recognize is it's the Wild West. It's unregulated. In theory, there are meant to be regulations that stop certain claims being made, but it really is an area where there is very, very little regulation. there is nothing to stop people saying what they want to say, and take advantage of people. And where I get really frustrated, this is obviously an area I'm sort of quite passionate about, but where I get really frustrated is that the ones that aren't reputable are preying on the goodwill of people who really want to do the best for their horse. And the horse is not benefiting from this. Um, the the owner is spending money, and there's no gain to this. There's a question there. Where's a good place to look for published data? It's not a perfect system, but ChatGPT is actually pretty good at it, especially if you tell it PubMed only. So PubMed, PUBMED. So if you say PubMed only, tell me about the gastric supplements that have been shown to work in horses, you will get quite a defined list, that is far, far, far more refined than you're going to get at the local horse show or other places where you might be given a lot of pamphlets.
Yep, good one. Okay, so practical scenario. You our pony club people are, they're at home, they've noticed behavioral change in their horse or pony. What sort of information is most useful for owners to gather before they speak to their vet?
The last 2 weeks of things we've talked about. So the thing is yes, it's important to it's important. The question was, the very first question we got was, when do I talk to my vet when we notice these changes? Sometimes these changes we see and the suspicion, oh, I wonder if it could be ulcers, can be the last little bit of oomph we need to get over the line to make that management change. We're like, well, I kind of want to make this management change, but it's a little bit hard and everything seems to be okay, so I'm not too fussed. And then, oh, now I'm starting to see this behavior. Maybe it's ulcers. That alone is, might be enough to say, okay, I'm going to make some changes to my management here. There is a cost attached to that, but I think there might be a real benefit. And a lot of the things we've talked about, most of the things we've talked about aren't expensive, aren't buying something. It's how we do things, not really necessarily what we're doing per se. So that's the first thing I would say. We can make a lot of these management changes anyway. And when we make these management changes, nearly every management change we've talked about is good for the horse's overall welfare, as good as it is for its ulcers. Then it's a matter of trying to be as clear and specific as possible when collecting information for the vet. And so what is the workload? What is the diet? What is it exactly that you're seeing? Where is it that you see it? A great example I would have would be, recently I was talking with a barrel racer, whose horse had started doing all these behaviors, and we have a chat, and the mum was telling me, and then the daughter chimed in. She goes, Mum, he's much better when I ride him in the rodeo saddle, not the barrel saddle. I'm like, hang on there. Just tell me a little bit more about that. And she goes, oh, nearly all of this stops when we have him in the rodeo saddle. But when I put the barrel saddle on, he starts doing this. I said, you need to go and check his saddle. So being as detail orientated as possible, I think, is valuable. Writing it down, I think, is really valuable. Writing it down, giving it to the veterinarian and letting them read it. Some owners are fantastic at giving coherent histories. Some owners are more creative in the spoken word than they are in the written word. Vets are generally very good at filtering through those histories. So write down what you see, give it to your vet, give them time to process that. And I think that's a great starting point.
So you would want to write down when it started,
When it started,
whether it's getting worse.
what is it?
Yep, what is it? Whether it happens on the ground or under saddle or at the mounting block or whatever the specific situation is.
Yep. Yep.
Observations about appetite.
What, when, where is the three really good places to start. What, when, where? What happens? When does it happen? Where does it happen? I think if you can do what, when, where, that's a really great starting point. And I think, like most of the time, one of the other values of writing something down, I think most people, when they sit down and write something, it helps them frame the story in their head as well. So it helps them frame a more clear picture of what they're actually think they're seeing or what they are seeing, but being able to communicate that more clearly, but also to understand it more clearly. I think most people, that's that, if in doubt, write a list. It's very much that. What are you seeing? Where are you seeing it? How often? All those types of things. But they're very basic things that you're looking, very basic in principle, what you're looking for.
And how useful would you find a video?
Videos can be fantastic. So videos, and I think this is where, we'll see AI come out with the ridden horse pain ethogram will change this. But video, the challenge for a lot of veterinarians is you're dealing with a horse. If it comes to a clinic particularly, it's very hard to do a lot of this stuff on the ground anyway, but you come to a clinic and the horse is worried about the noise over there, and then someone's driving a tractor, and maybe it's next to the airport, so there's planes taking off, and the horse is not going to give us any of these signs. And then it's also, hard in a clinic environment to see a horse ridden because it's not always safe, don't always have the facilities. So having those videos of what the horse is doing in its home environment can be really, really valuable. The other reason those videos can be really, really valuable is that when you sit down in a month, 3 months' time and say, are we making progress? You've actually got a clear reference point. Because it's amazing how our mind plays tricks with us when we either get improvement, but we don't see it, or we don't get improvement and we think we see it. So having an objective reference point like a video with the standardized, I love getting owners to do just a standardized dressage test. It's a 3 to 5 minutes. Just pick one of the low 60 centimeter dressage tests that you would do in 60 centimeter eventing or the pony club equivalent, and just write a standard dressage test at home. It's 3 to 5 minutes of footage that gives a lot of information about the behavior, but also a lot of things like being able to pick up subtle lameness that might only be evident in one movement in one direction or on one limb can often be seen in those types of environments that you can't see
Mm.
necessarily on the ground.
Yeah, yeah. Um, this is a good question from Kaz, and it circles back to why we want to avoid labeling a horse's behavior as a reason for it. Hearing comments like "my horse is trying to get out of work." Can you talk about little bit more about why it's so unhelpful?
Well, they might be trying to get out of work because work hurts. And so I think it's how we frame that narrative. It's the observation. I think my horse is not trying to do something. And then what do we do with that observation? So the observation's not necessarily the breaking point or the breaking point in the system. It's then what we do with that information. And it's whether we dismiss that information and blame the horse, or whether we say, hang on, this is a horse that has always been a willing worker. He's honest, he's kind, he's genuine. Why has he stopped doing it? And the why, I think, is the missing link there. So I think when we want to anthropomorphize those really higher motives, I think that can be very problematic in horses. But I think it's making sure we take that interpretation and ask the question, if I've observed a behavior, why is that behavior there? Um, is there a anthropomorphic reason, or is there a reason why a good, kind, honest horse might actually be making a decision like this that is actually a reasonable decision from that horse's perspective if we put ourselves in that horse's shoes and look at it from their perspective?
Yeah, yeah. And I think we've got to a point where it would be where we should bring in some more audience questions, because we've covered a lot tonight, and I think this conversation's really brought the whole series together.
Can I
Um,
make one more comment on that learnt behavior before we finish? The other
yeah,
one that I think is important, and it goes to Kaz's question there, is when we have this type of behavior, particularly when we have reactive, when we have fear-based behavior, traditional horsemanship has been to sort of override those horses through that. And what I will say is if you have a horse that has anticipatory behavior, particularly if it's fear-based behavior, and yeah, this is Kaz has said this, I just scrolled down. She says they'll work through it, they should work through it. You cannot scare a horse that's scared out of being scared, right? But how often do we see a horse that's showing fear-based behavior? Now, it might be subtle fear-based behavior. It might not be overt, like, oh, the world's coming down, I'm going to run away, because the horse is honest, kind, well-trained, and trying to do its best. But it is manifesting some form of fear-based behavior, aversive behavior. You cannot scare a horse that's scared out of being scared. You can suppress them, you can shut them down, you can make them do what you want for a while, but you're not going to get where you want to be in the end by that approach. And so that really starts pushing into how we manage a lot of these undesirable behaviors that become learned. Really has to focus on positive reinforcement, like the pre-exercise feeding, like the grooming, like the massage, rather than Kaz's words there, just working them through it or forcing them through it, which we can, but it's not going to give us the outcome we're looking for in the long run. And I think that's a really, as someone who came into the horse industry as not a horse person, it's probably a path I've had, which is, well, that's what I was traditionally taught to do. But actually, now we're asking a lot more questions around that.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there some more questions? Here's a good management one, harking back to probably webinar two on feeding and how long should the horse be allowed to eat before riding?
Okay, so how long should it be allowed to eat before riding? How long can it eat? But it can eat right up to the point where it goes riding. That's the first thing. They don't need a break between eating and riding. They're not like us that get a stitch if we go swimming within 30 minutes of having our lunch and our mothers lose their cool. They can eat right up to the point where they're riding. That's really ideal of what we want. We want them to be eating. How long? It's probably as much a question of how much. And Emma and I were talking about this. We've actually got a project going on with some colleagues I work with out of the University of Queensland. It's their project. I'm just on the side of that one, looking at exactly that at the moment, trying to answer how much do we actually need to feed them to reinforce that stomach's normal protective mechanism. So watch this space. We might bring that to you as a pre-publication exclusive at some point. We're doing the same work with travel. What do we actually need to feed them to make a difference during travel? What do? I give them a hay net while they're being tacked up. And so it doesn't have to be lucerne hay. It can be palatable grass hay. We just use palatable grass hay. They get a hay net while they're being tacked up. Ideally, it would be down on the ground. Ours is not necessarily there. It's just at shoulder height or in front of them. And the time it takes us to groom them, tack them up, get them ready to go, they've had a good opportunity, 15, 20 minutes to have a good munch on some hay and restore those normal defense mechanisms. And they're in a better brain space before they go out and work. And if they start in a better brain space, they're more likely to stay there rather than if they've come in with a negative association, got cranky because the saddle's getting put on, and now you're going out to ride that horse and ask it to do complex things willingly. It's pretty obvious which one's going to be more advantageous.
Yeah. Now it sounds like Audrey has a horse that on has on and off pretty loose poo, sometimes very loose, and it sounds like she's been told, that's just their gut. Is that something that you would accept or keep on
It's
investigating?
Yeah, it's such a conditional question. We definitely see variations of normal. We definitely see variations associated around some behavioral ones. Horses that get stressed will often have very loose stool transiently. The horse that poops every time it gets in the trailer, that's the fun one. There's a lot of variation. If it's just the horse in the field, or in its normal environment and it's got loose stool, um, I look at other factors around that horse. Then I look at other factors like, is it maintaining its body condition appropriately on the diet it's got, or does it take a lot of extra food? If it's taking a lot of extra food, it might be because it's not absorbing nutrients properly and there might be something else going on there. I look to see, are there behavioral manifestations there? And they are the ones that we will see hindgut disease in. So, the horse that has um, abnormal behavior, other things ruled out, and changes in their feces, they are the ones that will associate with hindgut disease because we can see a direct manifestation of it. So But if the horse is otherwise in good condition and completely happy, I wouldn't necessarily get too excited about it. I would monitor it. I'd monitor the whole horse rather than just focusing on the poop. It might be that horse is normal.
Yeah. Um, Penny's written about she thinks her horse's ulcers were caused by a change of property and no longer having access to a round bale. They've been x-rayed and checked thoroughly. And so her question is, once the ulcers are treated, as they put in as many environmental changes in place as they can to aid with their well-being, what the best practice is to ensure that they don't return. It sounds like
Yeah,
they're
so we
well on the
talked.
way.
Yeah, yeah. So we talk. I mean, you've kind of figured out why they happened in the first place, right? You took them away from an unlimited roughage source, and then something changed that meant they didn't have either the same amount of roughage available to them, the same type and palatability of roughage available to them, or something else in their environment that changed that. Maybe they're in a new herd, they're at the bottom of the herd now, and they don't have the access. It might be in the field, but they don't have the access to it because they're lower in the hierarchy. It might be that the horse is stable and therefore, even if it has hay, it's not grazing as a behavior as much as it did. So they're all the questions I would sort of try to work through. And we've talked about those a lot in the first two webinars that we've done here. Um, it is a time when I'll look for supplements, specific supplements as a bridge where, okay, you've recognized what was great, what's changed. There's a reason why that's change happened. Maybe you can't change that reason. And you've got to manage the situation you have the best you can. There are specific supplements can be useful. Wouldn't take you too long on Google to figure out which ones are the ones that I recommend for that type of bridging role. But I will always keep looping back to saying, looking for wherever I can make an incremental improvement in management. That really is the long term benefit, the long term goal. The supplement can be very valuable, but it's still, I'm just going to always constantly loop back onto that management question. Can I make an incremental improvement? Can I make an incremental improvement to manage my way out of it?
Mm, yeah, awesome. Um, I think that's with this without getting into quite individualized advice, which I apologize to people who've asked quite specific questions about their own situations. It's just a bit difficult for Ben to go there.
Yeah, yeah, there's a couple there, and I agree. So we won't make a specific comment. I would just make the general comment. Go back to your veterinarian, talk to them, have that conversation. If you have the horse that's been diagnosed, or you thought had ulcers, diagnosed with ulcers, treated, and the horse's behavior didn't improve, go back and ask the question again. Is there something else that might be driving this type of behavior? Um, and just you have to keep looping back. Vets like to solve problems. That's their job. So just keep looping back to them and keep working on it. And some of them can be super frustrating to work through, but it's amazing when you get there in the end and go, ah, that's what it was. We changed the saddle, or we looked at the saddle and it had a broken tree or it had a cracked tree. It wasn't obviously broken, but when we got, there was just something not right. And once we changed that, we got on top of the problem. So keep listening to your horses and keep talking to your vets, even if it feels like a bit of an endless loop for a while there, because it is really the only way to burrow down to the solution. Let's see. We've talked to someone else about supplements there. We talked about that. There's another one here. The manage around travel, i.e. on the float. I think that's a good one. So do we worry about choke while they're on the float? Do we worry about dust? And there are two schools of thought here. So one school of thought is that they must have hay during transport because we're worried about their ulcers. Some horses are obviously also happier with hay when they're transporting. The other school of thought is we're worried about those horses choking. We're worried about those horses getting dust in their airways. I personally do not feed my horses hay during transport, but anything up to 6 hours for me. What I do is because I'm worried about choke, because I'm worried about dust, what I do, and because I don't really feel like my horses eat it, they just spread it onto the truck floor. What I do though is make sure those horses have hay in their stomachs before they go. And as soon as they get off the truck, they get hay straight away to restore that normal defensive mechanism. The magic number is about 4 hours based on the research we have so far that if we take a horse away from food for about 4 hours, it's around about that 4 hour mark where that acid starts trickling up onto the squamous mucosa. So I have no qualms of anything less than 4 hours with really not worrying about them not having access to hay. I think in the big picture, um, that's probably for me the overall benefit favors not having hay, but they get hay as soon as they get off at the other end to make sure I restore those defense mechanisms.
And Ben, are you able to bring up the picture again of your munchie hay?
My munchy hay, I'll see if I can find it quickly.
And the point of that, I suppose, you brought that up in our second webinar to make the point that it doesn't have to be uh, the best quality hay. It's the importance of giving them something to chew on.
Yeah. Oh, seriously? What? Bones came on. Um, So, I mean, the first one is this one. This is our horses, 3 minutes after arriving at a horse show. This is them. They're sitting there tied up and they're getting ready to get, maybe we're setting up yards. In this case, we were just a day show, but they've got their hay. They're going to have that opportunity to restore their normal defense mechanisms. And obviously, they're happier with that as well. And then the specific munchy hay, I'll grab that very quickly if it's in here. Yep, here we go. Um, Just find Zoom again. Oops. Find Zoom again. Share. This is our munchy hay. I mean, it's not the most impressive stuff. It's grass hay. We let it get very mature. We let it go to seed. We let it get very long and stalky. But basically, the goal of this hay is we're not trying to feed these horses nutritionally. We're trying to give them something for them to chew on behaviorally. We're trying to give them something to form a fiber mat in their stomach to protect that acid from splashing up. So we've even had people come up to us at horse shows and say, "Hey, I've got this really nice bale of lucerne hay. Yeah, you can have it if you want because the hay doesn't look very good." And it's like, but hang on, this hay is here for a really specific reason. This hay is here, well, for two reasons. One is so the horses have something to do all the time, and the other is that they can get something in their stomach, a fiber mat in their stomach, and they can build it up. And it's I caught the other day on, I think it was your Welfare Wednesday, that Pony Club has the rule of, I think it's no longer than 6 hours without roughage or between feeds. That's fantastic. I was so impressed to see that as an industry leadership position. And that's what we're trying to achieve with the munchy hay. We're trying to fill that gap with the munchy hay rather than giving them really rich, high quality hay that if we gave them that much, they would just explode. They would just, they would be so fat, it wouldn't be funny. We're not, it's not a nutritional need we're trying to meet. It's a social need and a gastric need.
Mhm. Yes. No, absolutely. I think that's great advice. Oil. There we go. What can we say about whether you recommend to give
Yeah,
horses
so
have
oil.
off
So there's
oil?
there's a couple of things around oil. The first thing around oil is probably the one that everyone agrees on, which is oil is a great way of getting calories into a horse, and it's somewhat of a free pass. We don't have metabolic downsides to oil. So when we have horses that have high energy needs, oil is a fantastic way of getting the energy in without having to increase the carbohydrates. So, and we're in the process of updating the consensus statement recommendations for feeding horses with ulcers. And one of those things that we're looking at very critically is whether we lower the carbohydrate threshold even further than what it has been historically for our horses with histories of ulcers. So oil will probably become more important again in that regard, in the sense that oil as a form of calories for these horses that we don't have to give extra carbohydrates to. There is some data, it is very loose data, it's very disputed data, whether corn oil also reduces the amount of acid the horse produces. I'm not really sold on that, but I have clear benefits to oil as in terms of the energy requirements and fulfilling energy requirements in competition horses. Vegetable oils, I mean, canola oil is probably preferred over corn oil overall because of slightly better omega-3, omega-6 ratios. There's other oils, linseed, flaxseed oils, uh, ahi flour, not so much in our part of the world, that have higher omega-3 availability, that also have potential benefits. The good thing in Australia is that we don't have to worry overly about the whole omega-3, omega-6 discussion is because a very high percentage of our horses, pony club type horses, have access to green grass and they get their omega-3s from green grass. So it's a different, very different world when we have a horse stabled for extended periods and it doesn't have access to green pasture. We have to worry much more about omega-3, omega-6 balances. When we have horses with access to green grass, they've got a natural source of their omega-3s, it becomes much less something that we have to worry about. But it's definitely an issue in stabled horses. It's definitely an issue in the more intensively managed horse environments.
Hmm, that's very interesting.
Yeah, we worry a lot about vitamin E in green grass. Horses that don't have access to green grass are at high risk of vitamin E deficiency, and omega-3s are the same.
Hmm. Uh,
Um, Beet fiber is a good one. Yeah, someone just, yeah, Kaz Olsen just said the same thing. Beat you to it. Um, the fiber beet pulp is actually one of the things that's been shown that including beet pulp in the horse's diet reduces the risk of squamous disease. So where it's available, beet pulp can be a really simple, relatively cheap intervention we can add to the diet to that has some potentially direct protective benefits on squamous disease. There's a lot of little nuances once you get in there, of little things that we can play with.
absolutely. Well, I think we've covered most of them, so that might be a really good way to round out our series. So I think sorry, I'm just shuffling screens around while we oh, did another one just pop up there? Oh no.
No, you're
So
good.
thank you. Thank you for people saying thank you. It's very much appreciated. So, look, I think one of the biggest takeaways from tonight is that behavior changes are worth noticing. They're worth taking seriously. Sometimes ulcers will be part of that picture, sometimes they won't be, and sometimes ulcers may be there, but there may still be something going on as well. So, across all three webinars, we've talked about the role of treatment, the really critical role of management, and where other tools, including supplements, may fit in, and when they're used with realistic expectations and good advice. But the bigger message has really been to look at the whole horse, and that means thinking about their gastric health, pain, forage, routine, sleep, stress, workload, saddle fit, dental health, environment, and most importantly, the individual horse in front of us. Ben, is there anything that you would want to add about the number one thing you want people to take away from this series?
Oh, look, I think you just summarized everything so beautifully. I guess I would just take a sort of a high level position of we're probably somewhat preaching to the choir with the people in this room, the people that are interested in coming in, but also a lot of people in the community like Pony Club Australia. Um, there's a lot of voices in those rooms. There's a lot of traditional thought, and that's not to say that tradition is bad, but we are seeing a really big shift in our mentality around how we approach these diseases, and how they intersect with the bigger picture. So I would encourage the people who have taken the time to attend to also be those positive voices in those communities. It's not always easy because there can be some very strong other voices, but I think Pony Club Australia has set you up incredibly with resources and tools, and I've been very appreciative to have the opportunity to be part of that process.
Oh, well, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with our Pony Club community across all three webinars. You've made some really complex topics feel really practical and understandable, and I absolutely know our members and families and coaches and volunteers have really appreciated it. Um, And thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight and across the series. We're sorry if we didn't get to every question, but we really appreciate the interest and thoughtful discussion. And yeah, as Ben said, spread the word. The replay of tonight's webinar will be available on our YouTube channel probably by tomorrow afternoon, along with replays of webinars one and two. Point people to them, share them, spread the word. I've personally come across a number of people who weren't aware of them, but have gone and had a look and found it really useful. So, yeah, thank you. And thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone. And have a great night.
Cheers. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.